So we are continuing our journey into the real number universe with talking about properties. So what we're doing is we're taking a step back from the things that we already know about algebra. So you already know these properties, you probably just haven't called them out by name. So when we commute somewhere, that means we go to a location, right? The final destination. If you're using Waze or Google Maps, it might take you different ways, but you still get to the same location. That's what the commutative property says. It says if I'm adding two numbers, I could do 2 plus 3 or 3 plus 2, and I still get to my final destination of 5. How I get there is changing the order of the steps I do, but I still get to the same place. 2 times 3 is the same as 3 times 2, so no matter what, I get 6. So what the commutative property is stating is the order doesn't matter. If I go left to right, an addition statement, it's going to be the same as if I switch the order. So x plus 2 would be the same as 2 plus x. Same final destination. 5 times x would be the same as x times 5. You're at the same final destination. Now, the associative property can be somewhat hard to recognize. So if you remember back on social media, there's been this thing floating around where they're telling people to, solve this using the order of operations. Parentheses occur first in the order of operations, but there are times when the parentheses don't change the final answer. So if I'm in the solid addition statement, everything's being added. It doesn't matter what two numbers I add first. I'm still going to get the same answer. So the associative property is not only recognized by parentheses, because a lot of people want to automatically say, oh, parentheses, it's associative. Not always true. It's changing the order of the values that are being added in a different group. And then multiplication is changing the order of things that are being multiplied. So I can change my grouping. I can group the first two numbers together instead of the last two. I can group the first two numbers being multiplied together instead of the last two. So it's changing the grouping. Now, brackets are happening in part B because I have negative numbers. And remember from earlier, we talked about when we plug in those negative numbers, having that parentheses is helpful. That's why we're doing it here. So this part B is another reason why you can't just look for parentheses. You're looking for groupings. So here, a lot of students get here and they say, oh, it's associative because I see parentheses. But what's really happening? Let's look at the difference here. And the first one, I have 2 times 4 times 6. And the second one, I have 4 times 2. So I didn't change the grouping of numbers. It's still 2 and 4 grouped together. I changed the order that 2 and 4 were being multiplied in, which is going to be a commutative property. So don't, in the lab, just look for those parentheses. It's not going to be right. So I'm going to find each sum or product. This is kind of something that you don't need to do. You could just type it straight in your calculator, but it is in the section. So they're grouping things by twos, or you could type it straight into the Web 2.0 calculator. I'm fine with that. So let's look at the identity properties. Identity properties are when you get the same thing out from an operation. So if I add 2 plus 0, I'm going to get that 2 back out. That's an identity property. For multiplication, if I multiply by 0, it gives me 0. So we had to change it around and say, well, 2 times 1, I still get 2 out. So that's going to be an identity property. It's anytime you're getting that same value. So in addition, we're going to use the identity element of 0. In multiplication, we're going to use 1. And that's just saying because if I multiply 2 times 0, I don't get 2 back out, I get 0. So 5 plus what is 5? Well, 5 plus 0. That's an identity property. 1 times what is 1/3? 1 times 1/3 is 1/3. You get the same thing out. Done. Now, we can use these identity properties to simplify expressions. Because 12 times 3 is divided by 12 times 4. 12 over 12 is 1. So chances are you've reduced this fraction on your own, but never said, oh, I'm using the identity property. And why on earth is that the identity property? Because 12 divided by 12 is 1. So you're really multiplying 1 times 3/4. and that's where you're getting 3/4. So when you're solving an equation, you've already been doing this, but you haven't been calling out the individual properties. Why is it important to know these properties? Because as we progress in the course, we're going to be doing things with variables. And so I need to be able to say, use the identity property, and you go, oh, multiplication by 1. That's why we need this. And then in part B, I have 3/8 minus 5/24. I have to get a common denominator. So that common denominator process, because it's 3/3, is really an identity property. So you've already been doing this, but you haven't been calling that step of 3/3 out as multiplication by 1. Anytime you multiply by 1, it's an identity property. So here, when I reduce 4/4 is 1, that's the second identity property. So if we want to use the inverse properties are a little bit different. The inverse properties are when I'm adding something and I'm getting 0, or when I'm multiplying and getting 1. So 2 plus -2 is 0, but 2 times -2 is not 1. So I'm using the reciprocal of A to get 1/A to be able to solve that. And then in the second one, I'm utilizing that negative number. So if I want to use the inverse property, what plus 6 is going to be 0? Well, -6. In part B, what times 1/9 is going to give me 1? I'm going to take that reciprocal, and it's going to stay negative. We're not doing, we're not flipping and changing the sign. We're just flipping. So again, you've probably never stopped and said, am I using the identity property here with 1/2 and -1/2? No, you just know that, hey, that's 3y. But we can call it out when solving an equation and say, hey, I used the inverse property. Now, the distributive property, everyone is pretty familiar with that property. When we do distribute things, when there's an operation inside of the parentheses. So we give everyone that value. That is probably the easiest property to recognize because we call that by name. So what the distributive property says is that you're giving 1 to everyone. So you're giving that 4 to everyone through multiplication. You're giving that 5 to everyone inside the parentheses and multiplication. And there's that cool animation, and you simplify. I give the 5 to everyone. 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times -3 is 15. I can't take that any further because they're not like terms. Give everybody a -6. And then I just finalize my signs. So you're not going to get necessarily a number from these operations, but they are able to be simplified sometimes. Now, if there's a negative in front of the parentheses, it's the same thing as distributing a -1. So -1 times -5 is +5. -1 times +8 is -8. So this is the distributive property you have to really watch for when you're solving equations because of how those things are happening. The negative values are easy to mix up. And that's the end of this one. So take a minute, review this a second time, and remember the key is we want to be able to step back as we're solving equations, as we're reducing fractions, and we want to be able to call out what the property name is so that later on when we're not working with numbers and we're working with variables, we can identify if something has been solved properly and if the properties have been identified correctly.